Hey guys, it's Mr. Vieira. Just real quick before we continue on and finish up with chapter 7, it's important to know that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson both died on the 4th of July in 1826. Here's Mr. Eskridge.
All right, hey guys. All right, so I'm here to talk about the what happened, the consequences of the Louisiana Purchase and the consequences of the United States now having more territory. And so the first thing that we're going to turn to is Native American power. And so as the United States is continuing to further push further and further west, we start to have more conflicts with Native Americans. At the outset, we have Americans and Native Americans kind of playing out what the traditional diplomatic relations that they had prior to the revolution, in which Native Americans were able to relatively skillfully kind of play the European powers off of each other, or this playoff system, and kind of get what they wanted. Now that we have the Louisiana Purchase, we're having further and further conflict between Native Americans and Americans who are pushing onto Native American lands in hope of making a life for themselves. That being Americans who want a part of this American dream, want that 40 acres. And that land, so that they can have that land, so that they can participate in this democracy and also just make a living, live out the American dream. And so we're starting to see during this time, as diplomatic relations or treaties are starting to fall apart, we have Native Americans that are rising up and saying, this is enough. We are going to be completely destroyed if we continue to allow the Americans to make a treaty with us and then renege on that treaty or throw it out the window and just take our land anyway. So we have two brothers, Tecumseh and his brother Tenskwatawa, who also known as the Prophet. And what's significant about these two brothers is that they're able to relatively unify large numbers, large groups of Native Americans in this region against American encroachment. And what they're able to do is to bring a pan Native American resistance movement in order to stand unified against American invasion onto their lands. And so they use spirituality, as the prophet is able to say that, kind of blending Christianity and Native American mythology, to say that it is their destinies, that our will is the will of their God, the master of life, in order to see the Native Americans realize their own sovereign territory. Tecumseh dies later in the War of 1812, but before he does so, he successfully leads many battles between Native Americans and Americans. Unfortunately for the Native Americans, the Americans were able to win many more battles, and so ultimately the Pan Native American resistance really starts to kind of go away, and it certainly disappears with the death of Tecumseh during the War of 1812. And so we're starting to see, as Native American lands were captured and were taken over and would become the United States, we're seeing this institution of slavery continuing to move westward in the South. And so that's going to obviously become an issue once we get up to the Civil War, and we have the fight over slavery and whether or not to allow it in the Union. All right, I'm going to turn it back to Mr. Vieira, who's going to talk about the causes of the War of 1812.
All right, so we're just going to go over causes and effects of the War of 1812 real quick. Again, it's not a military history class, guys. So we're focusing on how wars and conflicts really shape and change the course of American history. One of the things that Jefferson did, or one of the things that happens after Jefferson left office, is Congress lifts the Embargo Act. The Embargo Act had been devastating towards the American economy. And so Americans begin to trade. But as Americans begin to trade, some of the old conflicts between the British Empire and the United States start to re-arise. The first and most obvious cause of the War of 1812 is this idea of impressment. American sailors were oftentimes, their ships were stopped at sea by the powerful British Navy, and they would be impressed into service. What that means is they would be used in the British Navy, aboard British ships, as deckhands for their Navy. This obviously is viewed as an infringement on American sovereignty and in the American rights. And so this is going to anger the American population, especially those working and living in port cities in the Northeast. Also, the British continued to have rather good relations and supply Native Americans with weapons, with material, with money. They trade and do business with Native Americans who had been in conflict with the United States of America, which as it's pushing farther and farther west. you begin to see during this time period a faction of the Republican Party that is really pushing for war, that really views the infringement and some of the things that the British had been doing as call for war. Two figures in particular who are going to be, we're introduced to these two gentlemen in chapter 7, and they'll be huge parts of American history for the next 30 or 40 years. Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, both men are going to be icons in the U.S. Senate and will really put their stamp on American history and the 19th century. So these various factors, the impressment of American sailors, the continued support of Native Americans by the British Empire, and just kind of the war hysteria that's going on, forces James Madison to ask Congress for a declaration of war. And on June 18th, 1812, the United States will again, after only about 30 years of peace, go to war with the British Empire. So to go over the effects of that war, here again to finish it off is Mr. Eskridge.
All right, hey guys. So just the consequences, just really quickly. So not all Americans supported going to war. We did have the Warhawks, and many people in the West, and many Republicans are supporting going to war against Britain. But we have Federalists who meet at the Hartford Convention in Hartford, up in New England in 1814, and basically what they're saying is they're declaring their resistance to the war. They're saying that they should restructure the U.S. Constitution to make it more difficult for the country to go to war. And so they they don't really have a lot of support, and rumors come out in the papers that they are talking about leaving the Union or seceding. And so that really leads to the end of the Federalist Party, and it's the death knell of the party that we'll see. And they're pretty much going to disappear into the history of the United States. The war really strengthened the sense of nationalism for the American people. So, after the American Revolution, people had kind of, went back to their day-to-day lives and had kind of forgotten about, the nationalism that was really alive during that time. And so with the War of 1812, one of the things that it did, it really reinvigorated this nationalism. We have things like the Star-Spangled Banner. We have Americans that are just emboldened with fighting and winning a lot of battles against the British. And ultimately, the United States, supposedly wins the war. The war ends. No one really wins. No one really loses. But the United States is able to maintain its territory and is able to, again, show that it can play with the big boys, if you will. We see what another thing that comes out of it is Henry Clay rises into prominence, comes up with this American system, which is supported by a strong national banking system, a protective tariff for U.S. businesses, which we'll continue to see the tariff play a really big role in U.S. history. And it also results in a network of roads and canals. So it's really like building the economic infrastructure of the United States so that the United States can become the economic powerhouse that it will become. Another thing that the war does is it brings to fame Andrew Jackson, who is a war hero. He leads the American forces to a victory in the Battle of New Orleans. If you had died during that battle, you probably would have been like, oh, that sucks, because the war was actually declared over before that battle happened. So I don't know, just a little fun fact of history. Another thing that we see the United States issuing, so James Monroe issues the Monroe Doctrine in 1823, emboldened by the War of 1812 and the relative success there. And basically what the Monroe Doctrine says is it declares that the Western Hemisphere is off limits to European influence, European control, and that the United States will defend and will protect and will look out for the welfare of not only North America, not only its territory, but also Central and South America as well. So basically, stamping this is our territory. You are not allowed here, and we are willing to defend it if necessary. So we're going to see this continuing change in America and the world. All right, guys. So just a quick reminder: Chapter 7 reading quiz on Monday, there's a reading quiz every Monday. So have a good weekend, and we'll see you guys back in a couple weeks. Have a good one. Bye.